Hi, welcome to StatStuff. I'm Matt Hansen. This lesson begins what will be an extended discussion on identifying potential root causes. As previously discussed, the analyze phase of DMAIC is when we'll use statistical analysis to validate what are the root causes. But it's here in the measure phase where we need to make some reasonable guesses at what those potential root causes are. By doing that, it will help us to know what data that we need to collect that we'll eventually analyze in the analyze phase. So in this lesson, I'll begin by introducing you to the Data Collection Plan, or DCP. This lesson continues to build on the previous lessons in the measure phase leading up to this one. But for now, let's quickly review why we're even needing a DCP.
Remember, what we're trying to do is build a transfer function, or that's that y equals f of x. And by now, we should have already identified what the project y is that we're going to use. So now what we need to do is figure out what are the potential x's that we're going to use to fill in that transfer function. So when we say potential, what we're implying is that we don't know for sure if, nor by how much, each of those x factors may be influencing the y. Now it's in the analyze phase that's going to help us answer that. But for now, what we at least identify is how to prepare for that eventual analysis within the analyze phase. So the big question we're trying to ask is, do you have enough data measuring the y and every x? Well, in order to answer that, the team needs to build a plan of what data to collect and how they're going to collect it. And that collection process is what we call the Data Collection Plan, or DCP. So how do I build this DCP? Well, when working towards some sort of goal, sometimes one of the things we can do is define the steps by starting at the goal and then working backwards toward that. So let's start with the goal and then we'll work backwards to figure out some of the steps we need to follow to eventually get to this data collection plan, or the DCP. So if our goal is that we want to build a data collection plan, well, in order to do that, we need to also first, before that, figure out how much time period, or what the time period should represent in our plan. That is, should it be long or short-term data? What's the time period that should be covered? Well, in order to figure that, we've got to identify what that time frame is for the short or long-term impact. Well, in order to figure that out, we need to also first figure out how do we know how much sample data we need to include. Well, in order to figure that out, we have to identify our sample size, like using the sample size calculator. Well, in order to do that, then we have to work backwards and say, well, how do we know what data elements to include in the measurement for the sample size calculator? Well, to do that, we need to figure out what are the critical x's. We might use a C&E matrix as a tool to help us figure that out. Well, in order to even figure out what are the critical x's, we need to know what are the potential x's in order to choose which ones are the most critical among them. Well, to do that, we need to identify the potential x's. And we might use the C&E diagram or the 5 whys tools in order to figure out what are those potential x's. So this is really our starting point. That's where we're going to start based off the information we've already gathered from the define phase now that we're in the measure phase, and we're going to use it following this first step of identifying the potential x's using these tools.
Now you'll find that there are many different ways that you can go about building a DCP. But what I'd like to show you is an effective method that I developed and used for building a DCP in a relatively short time frame with buy-in from your team.
Well, what is the overall process for building the DCP? Well, we could build it fairly quickly in just a 2 to 4 hour meeting with our team. And what I'm going to show you now are 5 general steps that you can follow if you're leading a team like that within a 2 or 4 hour meeting. I'm going to show you these steps within the IPO flow format. So we've got the input to the meeting, the things that are going to feed into that meeting before it starts. What you're going to include there are the define phase items, plus the why and the defect definitions. These are all the things that you probably have already up to this point before you're ready to meet with your team. So make sure you've got all those identified and you're ready to review those with your team and get their buy-in. Now, for the process portion of the meeting itself, the process of where the meeting is actually run with your team, is the first step within that, which is actually the second overall step, would be to validate the why and the defect definition with the team. So the information that you've already collected before as an input, now that you're meeting together, during the meeting itself, you want to make sure that your team agrees with it. Make sure they agree with what the why is and your defect definitions. You need to have that as your starting point. And the next step is that you want to identify the potential x's. This is where we might use the different tools like a cause and effect, that is a C&E diagram, which we'd also call like a fishbone diagram or an Ishikawa diagram, and also a 5 whys tool. And that's what we're going to go over as separate lessons. And then after you've identified the potential x's, you want to narrow those down to what are the most critical x's. For that part of the process, that's where you're going to use maybe like a cause and effect matrix or C&E matrix to help get there. Now, after working through all that, the output from the meeting of what you're trying to build overall is going to be a data collection plan for those most critical X's. And this is where you're going to use something like the sample size calculator and building the DCP itself to build it. Now, do we have to have all these steps before we're actually going to go collect our data? Is all this formality really necessary? Well, not necessarily. But before we quickly dismiss these steps and skip over them, I would ask you just these few questions ahead of time. First of all, do I have limited knowledge of or access to all the data for the Y in every potential X? Also, I would ask, is there a moderate to high risk that I could be missing some information for each of those critical X's? And also, is the team commitment to the project unknown, or is it relatively low? Now, if you would answer yes to any of these questions, then what you could be doing is putting your project at a risk for failure. And if that's the case, then you're probably better off setting up this formal team meeting like this, following these 5 steps that I've just reviewed at a high level here, in order to mitigate that risk as much as possible.
Okay, now let's explore in a little more detail those different steps and touch on some time estimates for each step.
Well, starting off with our meeting as the input to that meeting, the first thing we're going to do is go over the define phase items plus our Y and defect definitions. So at this point we should already have those things complete. So the critical components of the define phase that we want to go through with the meeting could include like the problem statement, the scope, and possibly a high-level process map or SIPOC. We want to make sure that they've got all that stuff prepared ahead of time before the meeting begins. Now for the meeting itself, when we're starting it, we're going to start off with a kickoff. Usually it's good to have like the sponsor or champion be a part of this, and it could be a brief thing to make sure everyone's on the same page and they set the right expectations for why they're there in the meeting in the first place. Then as far as that official step, the first step you're going to follow within the meeting itself, you want to validate the why and the defect definition with your team. This might only take about 15 to 30 minutes. So the team should review the following few things to ensure that everyone agrees. They should review the problem statement and scope. They should review the project why, that is the critical metrics that are going to be used to dictate the success or failure of the project. And they should also review the defect definitions. These are going to help ensure that they're targeting the right data for how they're going to be measuring these defects. The next step that we're going to follow within the meeting is to identify the potential X's. Now this might take about 30 to 60 minutes with the team to work through these things. This is where you can start with the cause and effect diagram, or the C&E diagram, also known as the fishbone or Ishikawa diagram. And you can also use the 5 Whys tool in order to drill down even further to find the potential cause. But actually what I like to do is I like to use a combination of a more simplified version of the C&E diagram implemented with the 5 Whys tool. So it's taking both approaches at once and combining them together, which is a part of another lesson that I'll go over. Now the next step that we'd follow within the meeting itself is to narrow down those potential root causes to what we might consider to be the most critical X's. This might take about 20 to 30 minutes to do with your team. So you can use the cause and effect matrix or the C&E matrix to filter down all those potential root causes to what they believe that are the most likely root causes, or the ones that you really want to measure because of the most critical X's. And finally, after working with your team, you've gotten that far, the output that you want to build with your team would be to build the data collection plan for those critical X's. Now this may take 45 to 90 minutes. This might take the longest amount of time because it can get very detailed to figure it out. So you need to work through each of those potential root causes that they identified, work through them one by one in order to assess how they're going to measure the data for each item. And you might use a sample size calculator as part of this in order to validate how much data you need to collect for each one. You might also want to consider the short or long-term data perspective as well to know what time period you want your data to reflect.
Alright, before we close this lesson, let's discuss how we can apply some of these concepts in a practical way.
I'd like you to identify at least 2 prior projects or initiatives that you might have worked on within your organization and ask yourself these questions for each one. How is the data collected for each of those different projects? Was there a formal plan that was defining what data that you need to collect and how you're going to collect that data? If there wasn't, then was there any reason that any of the data had to be recollected? For example, maybe you noticed as you were going through the project itself, you saw that some critical data was missing, or it didn't cover the correct time period, or maybe it didn't have enough samples, or that kind of thing. And how would the project or initiative have benefited, if at all, if there were a formal plan that was defined on how to collect that data? And then, why wasn't a formal plan created for collecting the data? Was it presumed that it was going to take too long in order to figure that out? Or did the people not really know how to build a plan like that? Or did not everyone think that it was necessary to build one? And if there was a formal plan for collecting the data, how did that affect the outcome for the overall project or initiative?
Well, that wraps up this lesson. Check out StatStuff.com for many more resources that can help you achieve powerful results. I'm Matt Hansen. Thanks for watching.